Brazil, dear students, colleagues, scholars, and friends. And good evening for those who are in Ireland. Jessica's friends, my friends in Ireland who are here today. They are really interested know, in knowing what we are going to talk about. So we are starting today a series of chats on migration, globalization, and social transformation in post-Celtic Tiger Island 2008 to 2020, considering the plays and films produced during this specific time. Today we are crossing the Atlantic and reach our special guest, who was born in Dublin, Ireland, Jessica Traynor. Jessica is an Irish freelance dramaturg, poet, creative writing teacher, the deputy museum director at ABEI, the Irish Emigration Museum, among other activities that she is really deeply involved. Her debut poetry collection, Leaf Swim, published by Daedalus Press in 2015, was translated in many languages. We are happy to say that Leaf Swim was also translated into Portuguese by my scholars, my researchers. I coordinated together with Monique Fau at UFBA. Her second book of poems, The Quick, 2018, has been held in high esteem by the Irish literary community ever since it was released. Okay. Noteworthy distinctions include the 2014 Island Chair Poetry Bursary, 2013 Hennessy New Irish Writer of the Year Prize, and 2011 Listowel Poetry Prize. Today, she's here to talk about Correspondences, an anthology of writings from people in direct provision in Ireland, in which she edited alongside Stephen Ray, a Northern Irish film and stage actor. I believe most of you know him because she's a famous actor. She is in Interview with the Vampire and Breakfast on Pluto and many other films. Correspondences has gathered much acclaim for giving voice to visual artists, photographers, writers trapped in Ireland's direct provision system. I have to say that I was very touched when I read every poem, every photograph, every painting, I must say, they produced, every poem as well. They are very, very poetic and they really express their sorrow, their pain. And this is why I was so much touched. So now we are delighted to announce here the presence of Jessica Traynor. Thank you, Jessica, for your generosity in accepting our invitation to share your experience on the production of this brilliant collection. So it's your turn, Jessica.
Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Noélia, and Monique and Laura and everyone. It's so lovely to be with you, even virtually, if not in person. I was in Brazil. I had the wonderful privilege of visiting Bahia for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations just a couple of days before lockdown. So my few wonderful days in Brazil with the wonderful translation of my first collection is my best memory before this very strange period of isolation that we have been experiencing all over the world. And it has been a very interesting time, especially in Ireland, where we have so much personal freedom to be confined to our homes, and to consider then the experience of people within the direct provision system who experience that confinement all the time. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the system of direct provision, just for those of you listening who may not know a lot about it, and just to explain a little bit and give a little bit of context. So when a person comes to Ireland and applies for international protection, so if they come to Ireland seeking asylum, they are put into a system called direct provision. Up until 2000, now I'm seeing that there's an echo from my audio. I'm just going to mute my microphone a little and see if that helps. Hopefully it will. So when a person came to Ireland up until the year 2000, they were provided with housing and could live independently while their application for international protection was considered. But in 2000, due to the rising number of immigrants, now still a very small number, a new system was put in place called direct provision. And in this system, people cannot live independently. They and their families are put into accommodation centres, which are often repurposed hotels or holiday camps. So they were never really designed for long-term living. And while in these camps, these holiday camps, these direct provision centres, people have their meals provided, they cannot work, they are given a small payment by the government every week. Their children can attend school, but they cannot go to third level education, or if they do get into third level education, into university education, they have to pay international fees, which in Ireland are extremely high, and most of these people have come from places where they have been oppressed, where they have fled wartime situations, so they don't have the kind of resources which allow for this to be a reality for their children. And so the problem with this system is mostly the length of time that people spend in it, because due to the bureaucracy around the application process, some people are left in direct provision for 10 years. So this is a hugely problematic situation, which breaches a number of human rights for people. You know, these people are not entering Ireland illegally. They're coming from places where they have been either, you know, their religion has been suppressed, or there is war, or you know, many other difficult situations. And really, the notion that they should have to wait between 5 and 10 years for their lives to continue is really disgraceful, especially in a country such as Ireland, which, you know, has recovered quite significantly from the recent recession. And even during the times of the recession, you know, we have always had the resources where we should be able to deal with these very small number of applicants. Now, I said a minute ago that the number of applicants have risen, but generally speaking, you know, in the last couple of years, we've only had about 3,000 to 4,000 people try to apply for international protection in Ireland. We are a hugely underpopulated country. There are many rural towns in Ireland that would hugely benefit from young families moving in, from a boost in the workforce. So this system really is not working, and it's not fit for purpose. And it's a system that many Irish people are very ashamed of, because we have our own history of emigration. Ireland has been shaped by the notion of people leaving the country. It only, I think, in 2013 did we start to see net inward migration into Ireland. But if we look back as far as the Great Hunger, the famine of 1845 to 1852, when, you know, the population dwindled from 8 million to 4 million, So we lost millions to starvation, we lost millions to emigration. Ever since then, there have been succeeding waves of emigration from Ireland. People have left Ireland right up until the 1980s. It was very, very common for people to leave Ireland. And really, it is only kind of Celtic Tiger and post-Celtic Tiger that people have been able to look at other options to stay in the country. But this does mean, again, that we are one of Europe's least densely populated countries, and we're also one of Europe's wealthiest countries. So the idea that we cannot deal with 3,000 people, 4,000 people a year who have come from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia, Turkey, places where political oppression is a reality, and the idea that we cannot help these people, I find personally shameful as an Irish person. And I suppose the anthology came about because Stephen Ray, the actor, is a friend of mine. I would have spent 10 years working in the ABEI Theatre, which is Ireland's national theatre, in the literary department, where I would have worked with many different playwrights, some of whom are probably known to you, Brian Friel, Marina Carr, Thomas Kilroy, Marco Rowe, and then another kind of younger generations of playwrights. But Stephen would have been in a number of productions at the end, and we became quite friendly, and he became aware of my work as a poet. And so I think it was in 2017, his theatre company and arts organisation Field Day, who are very well known for the work that they would have done with Brian Friel and Thomas Kilroy around the time of the Troubles, which was a wonderful artistic effort to foreground the historical and contemporary plight of Northern Ireland at the time. Field Day are still active, and they were organising a lecture series called The Right to Have Rights. And they invited me to read some of my poetry, which I had written in response to the plight of people in direct provision. They also invited a number of people who are currently in direct provision to share their experiences and stories firsthand. And so Stephen and I continued to discuss the idea of what we might do from our position of real privilege within our society to try and change things. Now, I think everybody who works in the arts believes that art, whether it's poetry, music, visual art, has the power to change things. But we had to be realistic and think, what can we as an actor and a poet do within our own sphere of expertise to create a meaningful statement and to facilitate the voices of these people who are not being heard. And because another thing about direct provision is that many of the hotels that have been turned into direct provision centres are in quite remote areas of the country. And people in direct provision do not have access to cars. So they are often quite segregated from the rest of the community, which breeds mutual suspicion and anxiety and fear and all of the kind of things that you do not want when you're introducing vulnerable people to society. And so Stephen and I thought, what can we do? What can we do to make a difference? And the idea of a book came about. And the idea of Correspondences was born. Now, the first thing that I was really concerned about was the idea of representation. And again, as I stated, myself and Stephen are coming from a place of immense privilege where we have the ability in our lives to sit and have a think about things like these and how we might help and change things. But we didn't necessarily want to speak for other people. Because much of the problem is that these people are not given a chance to speak for themselves. And we also were quite realistic about the idea that this was not an anthology to uncover artists hidden within this system. It was not an anthology that was going to focus on great art over the primacy of storytelling. So when we put out the call, we said, look, you don't ever have to have written anything before. You don't have to have painted a picture. You don't have to have written a poem. All we want is to give you the chance to share your story. Because one of the issues that we found in reaching out to people in direct provision is that it's very hard to get in contact with them. Many of them do not have access to the internet. These centres are in remote areas of Ireland. If you try and go to the centres in person, you will have to talk to the managers of the centre to gain access. And if the manager gives you access, then the people within the centre will not trust you. So, because they do not trust the management of these centres, because the management are often there to make a profit from this business. It is a business. These are private businesses who take money from the state in order to, feed and house these people. They are not people making a humanitarian effort. It is a money-making business. So the management and the residents often do not trust each other. I was lucky enough to have a number of friends who are activists in the area, and they were able to give me advice on how to reach people in the centres. Often they would pass messages themselves and then seek their submissions for this anthology. And that was the hardest part, was actually reaching the people in the centres. Usually when you edit an anthology, the problem is that you have too many people who want to be in the book. We did not have that problem. We set a submission date, I think it was March 2019. I still had submissions coming in as late as June and July, where people had only just heard about the book. And I'm proud to say that we did manage to include all of those submissions that came in. We decided that we wanted the proceeds of the book in total to go to a specific charity called MASI, which stands for Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland. And it is the only charity in Ireland that is run by people who are in direct provision currently, or who have been through direct provision, who have come through the system and been granted leave to remain in Ireland. And they have a series of demands, which you can see now on the screen. They're a wonderful, focused, dedicated group. And again, it was very important to me and Stephen that the money should go to people who have experienced the situation, so that we don't set we do not give the money to another group of well-meaning white folk, So because we are already in that position, and we thought, no, we really want to kind of move away from other people making decisions for these people and empower them to campaign for what they want and what they need through their experience. So all of the proceeds were set to go to NASI. And then there was the challenge of making the book itself as an object. And we were lucky enough that Stephen has a wonderful contact, a doctor called Dr. William Hall, who does a lot of charity work all around the world. And he's a wonderful doctor based in University College Dublin, and he's a pioneer in the field of making vaccines cheaper and available to people in the poorest nations of the world. So he's a wonderful activist in his own right. And he had some contacts in an organization called Atlantic Philanthropies, who are a kind of an American trust fund for kind of worthy literary endeavors. And various different philanthropic drives. They had allocated some funds to Ireland and were just wrapping up the last of those funds. So Billy, Dr. William Hall, helped us to get an application in to get a little bit of funding for this book. It wasn't a lot. We didn't need a huge amount, but we did need some money for the printing costs. And I also thought it was very important to pay all of the contributors, even a token fee, because I was very aware of the fact that people who are in direct provision are not sitting around with the time to write thoughts down in a beautiful way. They are engaged in a very difficult business of trying through solicitors, through various letters to the Department of Justice, through these interviews that happen as part of the process, which can be announced very quickly and can be very troubling and disturbing because they mean that people have to revisit past trauma. And they're trying to get their children into schools. They're trying to explain to their children why their friends from school can't come to visit them in the direct provision centre. They're trying to explain to their children why they've spent 8 to 10 years of their life in this place. And now, even though they've got wonderful points, they cannot go to college. So I really didn't want to ask anybody to do something for nothing. And so we had a little bit of funding to print the book. And we had a little bit of funding to print or to pay our contributors. And then the next step for me was about trying to create something that might outlast the anthology itself. Charity anthologies are a wonderful thing. They can help raise funds for a charity. They can help keep the issue in question in the public eye. And especially having Stephen involved was very good for that, because he's very known for his activism, but he's also a very famous actor and a bit of a celebrity in Ireland. So as soon as his name was involved, people wanted to talk to us. Whereas if it was just me on my own, or if it was the people from Massey themselves, we would not have got the same response. So there was a very good reason to have somebody like Stephen involved, and he was wonderfully giving of his time in order to promote the book. But what we did want to do was to try and address another one of the problems that people experience in direct provision, which I've already touched upon, and that is isolation. Isolation from Irish communities, isolation from their own communities. These are people from all different nationalities thrown together. They often don't speak the same language. Sometimes, especially if they're single men or women, they're put into rooms with other people who they don't know and who they've never met before. And I mean, the notion of having to experience that after having been through a traumatic experience is just horrible. But what we wanted to try and do was maybe create a correspondence, that's the type of book, between some of the artists and writers in direct provision and some Irish writers who are also very, I suppose, horrified by the fact that we have allowed, as a nation, this system to go unchanged for 20 years. So when I was seeking submissions from people in direct provision, I gave them the opportunity. I said to them, would you like to be paired with an Irish writer who will look over your work, give you some suggestions on it, maybe develop it a little bit with you, and then they'll write something in response to your piece. So we create a correspondence. And I hoped that the point of this would be to create friendships that would outlast the moment of the anthology. Because something like this happens, and if we're lucky, the book comes out, it's very well received, people talk about it for 6 months to a year, and then everybody gets on with their lives. But I wanted the people who are in direct provision to hopefully have built up some contacts in Ireland with people who care, with people who are welcoming of other communities and who are welcoming of difference. And so some of the people didn't have the time to engage with that process, but a lot of the people did, and they really liked the idea of having a professional writer look over their work and give them some suggestions. And we've had some lovely friendships come out of it. And I know that a lot of those people are still in touch with each other. And we have done a number of events around literary festivals in Ireland, unfortunately cut short by the lockdown in March. We should have been doing a lot over the summer. But in a lot of the ones that we did manage to do, there were a lot of people, a lot of the correspondents within the book got to meet each other in person at festivals and talk about the process of working together. And for me, I think that's the aspect I'm most proud of, because I hope it will actually make a lasting difference in people's lives. I should say now that the book is sold out. I printed 1,300 copies. I have sold them all. We've raised €15,000 for Massey. We've also probably given another €5,000 directly to people in direct provision through contributor fees, and then also a lot of the Irish artists who were also offered a contributor fee, they donated that fee to Massey as well. And we've had wonderful responses in that. A bunch of us got to meet the president. There's a lovely photo there, President Michael D. Higgins, who is very, very keen on the rights of asylum seekers. He is a real champion. The president in Ireland is a non-political role. There's very little that he can do actively, but he is a wonderful advocate, I find, for people and for human rights issues. We also got a lot of media coverage, which was fantastic. And it did mean that we were able to contribute to the debate during a very important time at the end of last year when there was a general election in Ireland. So direct provision, which is something that's spoken about a lot, but has not really made an impact as a voter issue, became slightly more central, not just through correspondences, but I do think that correspondences was part of the zeitgeist that contributed to that discussion. Now, the new government have committed to moving the area of direct provision from the Department of Justice to the Department of Social Welfare, which is not the kind of immediate shutting down that we hoped for. But it is a step in the right direction, because I think in many countries, I think in all countries, the Department of Justice is not necessarily a department or an area of government that is necessarily that keen on human rights. It takes a punitive approach. So the assumption is that you have broken a law, that you should not be here, and so you must be interrogated, where the Department of Social Welfare has a very different approach to people's rights, to people's needs, to people's lives. Neither are perfect, obviously, but I think that it has been long thought that the Department of Justice was the wrong place to place this issue, that, you know, an issue where people are dealing with hugely traumatic circumstances. Having said this, it's not all good news. During the COVID-19 pandemic, more problems in the system have been exposed. And the fact that many people are put in rooms together in close quarters, social distancing has been impossible. So there have been COVID outbreaks in direct provision centres. And there's one particularly scandalous case where a group of people in direct provision were moved from a hotel outside Dublin to a hotel in Caersaveen in Kerry, which is a very small town in a remote southwestern part of Ireland, a very beautiful place. But the hotel that they were put in had absolutely no provision for social distancing. And then when an outbreak occurred in the centre, the residents were locked in, which was unconstitutional, against the law. And now some of them are going on hunger strike. Hunger strike has a hugely powerful connotation in Ireland, obviously, when we think about the Troubles, when we think about Bobby Sands. You know, it is such an extreme response, and it is not something that is ever done lightly. And this news has just emerged in the past couple of days, and I'm horrified to think that these people are having to go to those extremes to get the notice of the politicians. And one of the reasons they're going on hunger strike is because their food is being rationed very severely within the hotel, again by this private business, not by an organisation that's run by the government, but by a private business who are taking hundreds of thousands of euro from the Irish government every week and not accounting for how it's spent, and not accounting for the way that people are being treated. So it's a disastrous situation. I worry for those people, and I really, really hope that something will happen soon. So it's a difficult situation. I'm glad to have been able to contribute a little bit to discussion around it, because the final thing I'll say, I suppose, before we move on to some questions, is that many Irish people, we are very reticent, I think, by nature. We don't like to interfere in business that we feel is not our own. And many Irish people that I meet have said to me, I want to do something about direct provision, but I don't know how. Because these people are so distant, we don't see them walking the streets. Or if we do, how do you identify them, you know? And in small towns, they're in hotels outside the town, nobody sees them. They might come and get an early bus to bring their children into school, and then they go back to the centre and nobody sees them. And we have a terrible tradition in Ireland of incarcerating our problems, whether it's the treatment of people in lunatic asylums in the 19th century, whether it's the Magdalen laundries, the mother and baby homes that we're hearing more and more about, and now direct provision. It's something that happens behind closed doors and people don't know about it. And even with good intentions, it's hard to know how to reach these people and how to do something that helps, because the system is created in a way that keeps you away, that keeps you separate. And as I said at the beginning, when I said the hardest part of this book was to get submissions from people, was to reach people in the direct provision centres in order to get their stories. It took me 9 months to do that. And I had a book to edit. So a generally well-meaning person, how are they going to get through that wall? So I think that is the real challenge, and I think that's the challenge going forward, is to mobilise people in Ireland and to create routes for other people to make those connections, and for us to prove that Ireland really is a welcoming country, because I still do believe that in our hearts, most Irish people are welcoming and do want to see a more diverse and inclusive society. So I hope that tells you a little bit about the project.
Oh, thank you, Jessica, and congratulations for the publication of Correspondences. But listening to you now, I'm thinking about the moment I was reading the book, and one few days later, I discussed the book with my students, my scholars, and the same feeling we had together. It was really very sad. It was really, as I said in the beginning, the book, the text is written by those people really touch us. I feel bad reading. It's really, I don't have words to express.
It's a funny thing. I often say to people, "Oh, I hope you enjoy the book," but I think "enjoy" is the wrong word.
No, it's not enjoy, because you go deep. You are involved with everything that they say, and they are really, the words really touched me particularly, and my students as well.
Yes.
We are really privileged because we do not live the same situation. So, but we can feel how sad it is to live with that hard experience.
Yes. One of my favorite experiences, and one of the most meaningful experiences for me during the various talks I've given about the book, was visiting a primary school with 10-year-old children in Carlow in the Midlands in Ireland, to talk to them about the book. And I chose one particular story, the diary I had to keep on, the young man from Afghanistan who recounts his journey across Europe. And he starts in Afghanistan, and he finally makes his way to Ireland. But what I did with the children was I pulled up a map on the whiteboard, and we traced his journey through all of these different countries, and they could not believe it. They could not believe it. And they said, "How old was he when he did this?" And I said, "He was 16. And they just, they kept coming to me afterwards individually and saying, "That's not true, is it?" And I said, "It is true. It is true." And they just, seeing it on paper, on the map like that, absolutely changed their perception of the kind of the hardships that people should suffer. Because I don't want to go and frighten 10-year-olds and tell them about the horrors of war, but I do think it's important for us to expose children to these stories in a way that allows them to kind of empathize, and to put themselves in that person's shoes. And that was a very kind of gratifying moment for me, because I felt that I had opened their eyes a little bit, not just to the sadness of the story, but also to the human endeavor involved. How much do you want to live in order to enjoy these hardships? And I think that that's an aspect of humanity that we all share, just that will to survive.
And there is a particular text when the writer tells us about the children, the opportunities that they don't have as our children have.
Yes.
They cannot have holidays. They have to stay in a narrow space and to do every day the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's boring. What a boring life they live.
Yeah.
So what about the future for those children? This is why they are addicted to drugs, when they get old, and even before getting old, and all sorts of bad involvement or situation. So anyway, so now my students also have a few questions that came up to their minds when they were reading. So I think at this stage of our chat, we are moving on to the next step. So the questions that they have prepared for you.
Yes, I see Giselle's question here about the system and how it compares to the workhouses. And the workhouses were a relatively different situation in that the workhouses were a system implemented by the British government. So, you know, I suppose in a sense you're looking at something that is implemented by a colonial power rather than by the nation itself. The workhouses would have been, you know, a very different Victorian mindset. And, you know, you're looking at this 19th century mindset of the deserving and the undeserving poor. And now some of that mentality, I think, remains today. And I think the workhouses were places of utter horror and degradation where people went to die, you know. So I don't know if you can necessarily compare the two. Because the levels of brutality that were common in the workhouses, you do not see anywhere in the first world, I think, today. But there are absolutely parallels to be drawn in that there is a lack of personal liberty. There is the sense that as an individual who is in need, your responsibility has to be given to somebody else who will make decisions for you. So you can definitely draw parallels there. Direct provision is something that the Irish people have implemented, not for their own people, but for people from other nations. And it is, I think, a big statement about the fact that these lives matter less than Irish people's lives. So there are some parallels, but also a lot of differences, I think.
Next question. Oh, this question was made by Giselle Wolkoff, professor. She's a professor for the University of Rio de Janeiro.
Oh, wonderful.
Universidade Federal Fluminense.
Ah, wonderful. Wonderful.
So next question. Is it written? Okay. Can you read it?
Yeah, well, it's just a comment, I suppose, from James saying one of the dark sides of Irish history, and there are many. And yes, I would agree with that. You know, we have a lot to think back on, coming to the century, you know, coming past the centenary of the birth of our state. It's very easy for the Irish people to blame England for a lot of our problems. But like teenagers, we need to start stop blaming our parents and start to take responsibility for our own actions. And I think that, you know, obviously a lot of the negative traits in Irish society are hangover from things like the Great Famine, you know, the troubles in Northern Ireland, still hugely present. We've come through a lot of trauma as a society. The trauma of emigration, you know, emigration is something that scars families, that tears them apart. But having said that, we reacted to our independence by creating a hugely conservative state, where the church and state were very heavily linked, where the church and its attitudes dictated a lot of our social activities and our social responses to people. And I think in many European nations where that was the case, Ireland is not the only one, or world nations where that was the case, you know, the church has left many scars on Irish society. But the church, much like a government, is made up of the people of Ireland. You know, this is not a foreign power dictating the way things are. It is a flawed system which allows us to be our worst selves. So I think we are still dealing a lot with the legacy of child abuse, both physical and sexual. of the way that women were treated, the fact that women were not allowed work after marriage for much of the 20th century, the treatment of homosexual people in the LGBTQ plus community, and homosexuality illegal in Ireland until the 1990s. There's a huge amount to recover from and a huge amount of trauma to process. And because we have become a socially progressive society, there is a sense that all of this history is very much in the past, and it's not. Going 25 years from homosexuality being illegal to legalizing gay marriage, that's an amazingly quick turnaround, but it doesn't undo the social stigma, the scars, the years of oppression, contemporary social attitudes. We now are dealing with issues like racism. Ireland has been a very culturally homogenous society because people left the country. As I said, they didn't come in. So we have a lot of catching up to do in terms of dealing with difference. So I think in Ireland there is a tendency to not talk, to not speak about issues, or to assume that everything has been taken care of and all of the problems have been solved. And that, I think, is not a realistic attitude.
So James Spalding is a musician from Ireland. I'm not sure if you know him. Do you?
I recognize the name. Yes. Yeah. Is he in Brazil?
Yes, he lives in Brazil.
Oh my goodness.
He speaks Portuguese brilliantly.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, hello, Sanyo, by the way. It's lovely to see Sanyo, a question or a comment from Sanyo. And yes, Evgeny is one of our wonderful contributors to the book. Yes, and I think this is really a really interesting question. So Evgeny was part of a think tank in St. Petersburg, and had a wonderful life there. And the Russian government has become more and more oppressive of homosexuality, and the situation there in many Eastern European countries is getting really frightening. So Evgeny has now come to Ireland and has been granted leave to remain and is living here now. But one of the things I always think about Evgeny is he's incredibly talented. He came from a place where he had a wonderful job, a wonderful life. But now in Ireland, those qualifications don't necessarily count anymore. He has to start all over again. And I think that's incredibly difficult. We also have a lot of people coming from South Africa and various different African countries who are fleeing homosexual oppression. And I think that it is something that's not taken seriously enough by the Irish authorities. I've heard of the incident of one young man from an African nation who claimed asylum here on the basis of his sexuality. And in one of his interviews with the Department of Justice, where they fact-check your story, they said to him they didn't believe that he was gay because he hadn't joined any gay support groups since he'd been here, and hadn't been, taking part, like going to gay bars. And I mean, this guy was kind of going, he was working on his leaving cert, which is the final secondary school exam that we do here in Ireland. And he said, I had to come here because of my sexuality, but I didn't immediately start to express it when I got here. I've been trying to, I'm a teenager, I'm trying to get my life on track. So I don't think that those claims are taken seriously enough. I think that there is a tendency in Ireland for us to look at countries like Afghanistan and Syria and say those people are worthy because there's been a war. And then we look at people from African nations, maybe from Turkey, maybe from Albania, maybe from Russia, and we say, well, there aren't really any problems there. And it's specifically with women from African nations, who a lot of them are fleeing domestic abuse and violence. I feel that those, now this is anecdotal, but I feel that those issues and the issue of sexuality is not taken as seriously. I feel like it's not, I feel like there is a kind of a list. And number one is, are you from a war-torn country? Number two might be, are you gay? Number three, have you experienced domestic violence? Number four, have you experienced political threat? It's very difficult, but I have not been impressed by the Department of Justice's response to people whose stories involve persecution due to their sexuality. So I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't think that this is kind of a tricky one. Our Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, who's now no longer our Taoiseach last year, he said, well, if they don't like direct provision, they can just leave. Now, I think you can stay in Ireland while your direct provision or while your application is being assessed, but you aren't able to work, you aren't able to claim social welfare. So unless you're independently wealthy, you can't pay rent. Rents in Ireland are incredibly high. There's a housing crisis at the moment because our Conservative government will not build social housing. So there are other problems there. So it's kind of impossible to live outside the direct provision centre. And there are some illegal immigrants in the country, absolutely, but they live very much beneath the radar. It's not like the United States, where there is a kind of a strange two-tiered system whereby illegal immigrants are paid outside of the tax system. And I always find that very strange in the States, that they seem to have set up a system whereby people could live illegally for many, many years. It's not as easy to do that in Ireland. So I would think there probably are people living illegally, but those numbers are very, very small. And with kind of freedom of movement in the EU, generally speaking, those kind of people might move from country to country rather than coming to Ireland, because they would find it hard to get work. They can't get any social welfare payments. It would be very difficult for them to pay rent. So I think those instances are quite small, if that answers the question.
Thank you. Lucas.
Yes, thanks, Lucas. It was a very interesting process that I didn't get to meet a lot of the people whose stories I was sharing until the book was published. And then we were able to hold a big launch in Dublin, and I had a little bit of funding to bring those people to Dublin and get some of them accommodation for the night. Because a lot of these people have small children. They have nobody to mind their children. You know, they can't afford to take public transport. They can't afford to just drop everything and come to Dublin for the day. So the night that we launched the book last November was a really special night, because I got to meet people for the first time face to face. And I found it very difficult to ask people for these stories and then to read them. And I had to, I suppose, leave my emotions at a remove and try to simply put the book together. In a way, it was wonderful to have that focus. I would read the piece and I would say, okay, yes, this is wonderful, and we have to put it in. We have to, do the next step. So that was hard, but in a way, the focus of the book helped me to kind of keep going and not to get weighed down by the emotion of it. And then learning about the conditions that people live in. I'm learning new things all the time about it still, because not every direct provision centre is the same. Some of them are run better than others. Some of them people live in better conditions. I know one woman, for example, who is living with her children, and they have their own little house that they live in. And yet, it's been 6 years. Her children are going to be grown up by the time they get out of there. So it fluctuates wildly from place to place. And then I know other people, I know one guy who was in a room with a man who was deeply homophobic, and he was very, very afraid that there would be violence. So, yeah, I am constantly shocked by the new things that I'm learning. For example, the hunger strike in Kerry that I mentioned, that was a real blow this week. Because we'd had some good news, and then it just feels like things aren't changing yet. So it's been tough, but never that tough for me, always tougher for the people in the book. And yes, thank you, Fernando. So balancing so many voices, tones, and artistic views. Myself and Stephen had a lot of conversations about how to lay out the book. I suppose one of the best guiding principles was the fact that many of the pieces were written in companion. either the writers had mentored the people in direct provision and they'd worked together, or in some cases where we had less time because a lot of the submissions came in very late. I published the book in September and I was still getting submissions in July, maybe even in August. So in those cases, I would sometimes just have to ask an Irish writer and say, look, I'd love you to read this piece and would you write something in response? But those pairings make up the spine of the book. And then I was really looking at gender balance. I wanted to make sure that we had the spread of various countries represented. And tone as well is obviously, as you say yourself, important. And it's nice to kind of contrast some of the more factual, hard-hitting pieces with something a little bit more poetic. We had a number of visual artists contribute. I wanted to punctuate the book with those pieces so that they weren't all in one place. And then I suppose the final thing to think about was, I think that might be everything. Yeah, there were some factual pieces that were there. I wanted to make sure they weren't all together. So it was really just creating a jigsaw, laying out all of the pieces, discussing back and forth what we thought about it, and hoping to kind of create an arc in the book that would sustain people's interest and would surprise a little.
Sunny again.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think some of the people were already artists, were already working. So Vukashin, for example, who has done some of the photographs, he has a wonderful website called Asylum Archive, and he has been documenting direct provision centres around Ireland for a long time. He's now out of provision. So he was already very established. So I was kind of approaching him as somebody who I felt was a really important voice that I wanted to make sure was represented. And then some of the other people, I think, were people who are just starting to get into writing for self-expression. And a lot of them would have been involved in small local community writing groups. So they had already been reached out to a little bit by activists working in the field, but they would not have had the confidence or the opportunity to publish anything yet. Some of the other people are activists, like Donna Vuma, who wrote really passionately about her experience as a mother in direct provision. She's one of the co-founders of Massey, so she is very used to articulating her responses. Most people were delighted to be asked. I didn't target anyone. I put out the call and the people came back to me. There were one or two people who didn't come back, and I would have loved to have then said, by the way, would you like to contribute? But I didn't want to push anyone or to make anyone feel uncomfortable. And so I let it be known. I made sure that they were aware of the submission call out, but I didn't want to push anybody because these stories are so personal. And there is a fatigue, a tiredness that comes in when you're asked to tell your trauma story again and again and again. So we weren't prescriptive at all about the subject matter. We said, you can write about whatever you want. Some people wrote about the experience of direct provision. Some people wrote about leaving their home countries. It was whatever felt right to them. And people seemed very happy with the book itself. They were very proud to be involved in it. We had a wonderful night when we launched the book where almost everybody in the book was able to come together. And then in doing various events around the country, I would make sure, for example, if we were in the Galway area, that some of the people living in the west of Ireland in direct provision would be invited to those events so that they got to be involved in the longer life story of the book. So the reactions have been good. The one thing I would say is that I've been aware the entire time that these are people who have suffered trauma. So many of them have real personal difficulties which they're struggling to overcome on a daily basis. So I always try to be aware of that, because they're not aspiring writers in the way that I get invited to a festival and I'm delighted and it's a lovely thing. This is very different. So I've tried to bear that in mind with every event and approach it with sensitivity to make sure that everybody felt comfortable and also that everyone was being paid, which was very important too.
I don't want to. Okay, Gisele has a question. And after Gisele, I think you will stop, because I don't want to make you feel tired, because and I close with my final words.
Okay.
Gisele?
So Giselle, so I suppose, yeah, I mean, my own writing process, the only reason I have a poem in the book, the last poem in the book, I was very bold, very cheeky, and put my own poem in last, was because Canyo, her wonderful poem Scars, came in so late. It was, we were typesetting the book, and her beautiful poem came in, and I just didn't have time to ask anybody else. I thought, I can't ask somebody to write me something tonight. So I sat down and wrote the little poem that went with hers, and that was a very unusual experience for me to have to write something so quickly. It was terrifying. I would usually want to take a lot more time and care. But I was glad that I did it, because it meant that Canyo's piece could be in there and not on its own. And we've since met a few times, and it's been really lovely to read our poems together. And then the book in general and what books do. Look, I am a person who I think I can approach something both with a great sense of the magic that art creates, but also a cynical sense of the magic that publicity creates. So for me, the project was about both. And as I said earlier, for me, the proudest moment are, when I speak to someone like Yevgeny and I find out that he and Anne-Marie have just met for a coffee, or when I find out that Claire and Marwa are, she's giving Marwa writing tutorials for her Leaving Cert, which is coming up next year. These are the things that really make me happy in terms of what I think art and books can do. And then in the more cynical side of it, yes, the publicity is important. Because, as I said earlier, I think Irish people do care about this issue. They just don't know what to do. And if they're seeing this on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and there's something on the TV, we did a great TV interview at one stage with Ola, one of our wonderful contributors, and with, oh gosh, who was it with as well? Gosh, my brain has gone blank. Oh, Rehan, wonderful Rehan as well, who's amazingly articulate. Those things help to spread the word. So I think that you have to approach these projects with two very different minds. One about, yes, you have to believe that what you're doing is right, and that there is this transformative power in art, and that people will be looking at this book and they'll be able to get it from their local libraries and they'll share it with their friends, and that will mean something. But that also, that if it's to succeed, you have to write the press release. You have to have somebody like Stephen on board who cares passionately, but it was also a big name. And I'm not afraid to say that those things matter just as much. And I wish they didn't. I wish the endeavor and these people's voices, which are the most important thing, I wish that's what sold the book. But I think probably having the big name actor on board as well, and Stephen was so generous with his time and aware of that. He's actually quite a shy person. He was more nervous about the TV interviews than I was, which is ridiculous. I said to him, "You're not allowed to be nervous. You do this all the time." Whereas I'd never been on live TV before, so I should have been terrified. But there is a balance between those things, and I think if I were to advise anybody to do something like this again, getting somebody recognized on board as your ambassador, and in my case, co-conspirator, was the thing that really gave it its wings, I think, and meant that it got out there to an audience who might not listen to the words direct provision, but will listen to the words Stephen Ray.
Okay, Jessica, you say in the beginning of your book, when you introduce the book, who is coming? James. Okay, James.
Oh yes, James. I say American Army out of Shannon. I think it's an absolute disgrace. One of the wonderful poets in this book, Sarah Clancy, who lives in the west of Ireland, has campaigned a lot around that. I hate the special relationship between Ireland and America. I think it's I think it's disgraceful. I think Irish politicians whinging about Irish illegal immigrants in the USA while locking people in direct provision centres is the most base hypocrisy. I could go on, but I think you get, I think you get my thoughts.
Okay. Finished?
Yeah, that's my rant over. Sorry.
My question now is about the introduction. When you present the book, you mention your father, what he has left for you, and your proposal. What do you intend to propose to leave for your children? Remember? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I am.
You compare past and present.
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to the thought I've been tangling with the whole way through this process, which is if Irish people knew how to fix this problem, that the problem would not exist. If the problem was not behind closed doors, would it be a problem anymore? So that's very abstract, but for people who haven't managed to read the introduction, I talk about a conversation that I had with my father. And my father grew up in North Dublin in the 1950s. And he would have grown up quite close to the site of one of the big industrial schools in the city. So the industrial schools were where boys were sent, often young boys were sent to these schools. Often it was said because they were poorly behaved or because they were orphans but generally speaking, these were places where boys were kind of beaten, abused and neglected. And it's part of the very sad history of church and state oppression in Ireland. But my question to my dad was, I said, well, what did you know, as somebody who lived near this place, what did you know about it? Did people know what was going on behind these closed doors? Did people know these boys were being beaten by the Christian brothers who run the school? And he said, well, the threat you'd hear, you'd be out playing on the street and somebody's mother would come out and say, if you don't come in for your dinner now, I'll send you to Artane. So it was a threat. People knew that it was not a place that you wanted to be. And I thought to myself, I have a child, she's almost 3. Mm-hmm. And if she asks me in the future, what did you know? What did you know about direct provision? And maybe then she'll ask me, what did you do about direct provision? So at least now I'll be able to say I did something. Time will tell. Nothing is ever enough, of course. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy in this modern world with horrific stories coming in from every angle, from the way that the Rohingya people are being treated, to the Uyghurs in China, all of these different stories, to those poor people in the direct provision centre in County Kerry. It would be so easy to say, it's too much, I can't do anything. And I feel that I've been guilty of that in my life. Not the worst thing to be guilty of, but I think if we could all just try and put ourselves out of our comfort zone a little, maybe we could all make a bit more of a difference. So I hope that this book will be a tiny bit of a difference made, and that would be my hope for its legacy.
But it has been made.
Yeah.
So now I could see that Monique just arrived or was there, and you can make your question, Monique. Monique? No? Oh. No question for Monique? For Jessica, Monique? Anyway, so I don't have questions to close our conversation today, but we have a proposal.
Okay.
Yes. What kind of proposal?
I don't dare to guess. You have to tell me.
Yes, discussing correspondences yesterday with my scholars, and the idea came up to translate into Portuguese.
Oh, wow.
Correspondences.
Oh, my goodness. That would be amazing.
You have to discuss with Stephen about this.
Oh,
if you
I think he'd be delighted, and we might even be able to get him to come for the next launch to Bahia.
Yes, this is a good excuse to come to Bahia. Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds like a wonderful project, and you would have mine and Stephen's blessing. I think that you like a challenge.
Yes. Too many languages. It's an intercultural work.
Yeah. But it would be fantastic, and I would love to think of it having another life like that. And I think all of the contributors would be very really delighted to think that it would reach an audience outside of Ireland as well, and that their stories would travel so far.
Yeah, and it's going to be a way to disseminate this kind of experience.
Yes,
that sad experience. We Brazilians have already, or we are still living sad experiences here. But it's good to know what people from abroad also live.
Yes, yeah, wonderful.
Because we think our problem is the hugest one.
I know.
But,
yeah.
When you see people's problems, foreigners' problems, they also have their specificity. So.
Yeah, and I think anything that reminds us of our shared experience and humanity, I think is good for us as individuals,
And this kind of work that you and your co-editor did, it's deserved to be shared. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Jessica. Oh, and a question from Rafael Magalhães. Last moment, Rafael. Could you read it?
Well, yes. So I'm talking about mnemonic items. And yes, memories alludes to. I think that's a really interesting question. And I suppose, really, in a way, the book is a snapshot of Ireland in the current moment, but it's also a snapshot of a world in movement. And for me, I think that the great resonance of this text will be a reminder that migration is a constant. I hate the term migrant crisis. I use it myself as a handy catch-all phrase, but nations, people are always moving. And I think the memory of movement and the memory of migration and the memory of change, this is part of every country's foundation myth. And sometime in the 19th century, the myth of nationalism emerged and cemented everybody into one place, And I feel that that's such a damaging myth. And the notion that the Irish people feel this intense nationalism, but then trace their history back to the Book of Invasions, which talks about the various mythical races in Ireland who were displaced over the course of many years. There is a cognitive dissonance there, celebrate coming to one place and making it your own forever. And I think it's been one of the most damaging myths of our modern world. And I hope that if this book is a testament to anything, it's that movement and change are constant, that you can pick up this book now, and you can pick up any of the great migration or movement myths, from Melmoth the Wanderer to the Odyssey to the Iliad. Any of these things are about movement and change and cultural shift. And that it will be another reminder that these things happen always, and that although many of them stem from tragedy, people coming to a new country is always a new beginning, and to fight our instinct that change is bad. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think for me that's the resonance that comes when I read this again as a single but many voiced work.
I can say that this book came at the right time, because I also can say that nothing happens accidentally. You came to Brazil for the book launch, your book of poems launched, and then you came with this book. And coincidentally, I'm doing my postdoc
It's
on
perfect.
migration, immigration.
Yeah.
So, and I took the opportunity to read and see how many ideas they are helping me.
Yeah.
I can find many different subjects to develop based on your book. So thank you, Jessica.
I'm so glad.
Yes, I'm really delighted to have you again.
Yes, yeah, and I hope
I think this friendship is going to continue forever.
absolutely.
I'm not stopping, get in touch.
Absolutely, I hope so, and I'm just hoping that your group of students won't finish up now and move on. You have to keep them.
Yes, and I can say that if they have more questions, I will send you the questions for you to answer, because I believe after this chat today, they're going to have lots of questions, and we can send you to appreciate your answers.
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Give my regards to your co-partner in this.
I will. He couldn't be here tonight.
Yes.
Stephen is in Donegal, where they have no good internet. So.
And a big kiss to Abigail.
Oh, absolutely.
3 years now.
Yes, almost. Yeah.
Almost in October, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.